Okay, so today's video is going to be for those of you that have been asking me, Jay, can you please do like a BIOS guide? Teach me what I need to know about my BIOS, teach me what stuff to stay away from, teach me what things can make me have a better experience. I've talked about this in the past, but I've never done like a definitive guide. So today we're going to start with AMD's BIOS. I'll do another version of this for Intel. It's just obviously AMD right now is kind of like the dominant player in this space. And we're going to be doing this specifically on my GPU test bench, which is an ASUS board. You'll find some variants with other brands like MSI and Gigabyte/Aorus, ASRock, etc. But overall, the effect is going to be the same. So you might have to do a little bit of research to figure out like exactly what something's called an ASUS might be in another brand. But overall, it's really not that difficult, and it's important to not go in there and start messing around with stuff that you don't understand. So hopefully today you'll have a better understanding of what your BIOS is and what you can do in there that might actually give you a more fun and enjoyable experience with your computer. First things first, how do you get there? You gotta mash the delete key. People are gonna be like, Jay, you can just hold it. Look, I'm an 80s kid. We had to mash it, okay? And I'm just gonna mash it.
And holding it doesn't always work.
Not always.
Not on every keyboard.
Usually when you see the splash screen right here is where you need to make sure you hold it. But sometimes the splash screen may not come up. You might just go right to the Windows loading screen. It depends on how long it takes your monitor to wake up and sense the signal and all of that. So anyway, as you can see right here, this BIOS looks a bit different than you might have seen with other ASUS BIOS. They kind of updated the GUI a little bit. So this is what's known as a UEFI BIOS, not a legacy BIOS. Legacy BIOS and UEFI are not the same. We're not talking about that today. Anyone running a modern AMD CPU is going to be on UEFI, not legacy. But this is just a little different in the way that they're displaying the information. So let's go ahead and understand some of the basics here real quick, and this is actually perfect for us to use right here. CPU frequency and CPU temperature. This is nothing more than showing us where our base clock is, that's normally the number you see on the box when it comes to like the speeds that are advertised. You're gonna always have a base clock, boost clock because there is turbo frequency involved, but this is showing up to 5.3 gigahertz boost clock. Now right now I do have a manual frequency set because this is our test bench and we need to lock that down. So that's the reason why it's saying 5.3 on there right now. This is just a temperature slider here. B clock stands for the base clock. All frequencies are based off of that base clock. So it's called the base clock and everything's based on it. So you'll also find right here the ratio. This is the multiplier. So the base clock times the ratio gets you your frequency. That only matters because back in the day, sometimes for overclocking, we might not have had a very strong overclocker when it comes to multiplier, but we might have had a good base clock overclocker where we could have gone and made it like a 110 or a 105 and with a lower multiplier still giving us a faster effective clock. The problem with modern systems is that affects everything in the system. The PCI Express clock, all of the different clocks that are like the chipset, all of that are based off the base clock, not just the CPU. So my recommendation when we go in here and show you the Tweaker's Paradise, which is not just known as Victorville, is the fact that you don't want to change that because it will change everything with your system and then you'll start getting into crazy instabilities and or no posts, and there's just no point. Things are good now and very solid with using the multiplier. Memory frequency, this is the effective frequency of your memory. Now keep this in mind, you might see that number represented as 3000 megahertz instead of 6000 because it is double data rate. So the effective data rate is going to be the base rate times 2 because it is double data rate, DDR. So you might see in the frequency drop down on some BIOS that might say half that speed. That doesn't mean that's the speed you're running at, it's just that's the base rate for the double data rate. Also too, you might notice right here, people have yelled at me so many times in videos saying, Jay, why do you keep calling it megahertz? It's mega transfers. Apparently, it's an interchangeable term, technically. You can see right here in the BIOS, they're clearly calling it 6000 megahertz, but you might see 6000 M/Ts, which stands for mega transfers. At the end of the day, it really doesn't matter what you call it. It's going to be the same thing. It's just, as you can see right here, some brands call it megahertz, some call it mega transfers. The box might say mega transfers on your RAM, and then it might say megahertz. Don't get all confused on that. Just care about the number. All right, moving on. MISC Voltage stands for memory controller voltage. When you enable Expo on your RAM, or XMP if we're talking about Intel, or DOCP if we're talking about like AM4 and older RAM on DDR4, to get those frequencies outside of the JEDEC standard, which is basically the out-of-the-box speeds without enabling any of the memory overclocking, the voltages will be much lower. So the Expo/XMP frequencies also have a voltage requirement that go with them. Typically 1.4 volts is what you find on DDR5 these days. You might even see 1.45 on some RAM, depending on, its ASIC quality and such. Prediction, ignore this. This is basically an ASUS thing that's saying, hey, based on your current temperatures, based on the voltages that we currently have, based on the frequency it's currently set, we have rated your cooler at 154 points. Therefore, our auto overclocking features believes that your cooler is capable of XYZ. It's just it's not even AI. They like to call it AI, but it's not even AI. It's kind of garbage. Just ignore that. All right. First things first, we are currently in the advanced mode, as you can see right there. If you might see something that looks like this, which is easy mode, and you might see a different variation of this. Easy mode is where most people will spend most of their time. This is where you could do things like flash your BIOS, Aura. You can even control Aura settings on the newer motherboards without having to actually install Aura on your system, which is really nice to have. You can see your fan frequencies right here. You can see we have our fans set to 100%. That's how we do it on our GPU test bench. You can see our AIO pump speeds. As long as those headers are plugged into the right device, right? You have the pump plugged into the pump header and you have the fans plugged into the fan header or a fan header, then it will look correct. Otherwise, AIO pump could say 3,200 RPM because it's a fan hooked up to it. Now, it's also important to note that AIO pump and W pump plus are two different things. AIO pump obviously would be like running an all-in-one cooler. W pump plus is intended for you to plug in the voltage or the RPM signal from, say, a water cooling system that is not being powered by the header, but your system still needs to know what your pump is doing. That way you can speed it up or slow it down if it's a PWM controlled pump, but it still receives power from a SATA plug or a Molex plug. This just allows you to communicate with the pump, but the motherboard is not controlling the pump via power. Does that make sense? So the AIO pump is getting powered usually by the motherboard, but the water pump plus, it would be like a D5 pump or a DDC pump that has a voltage and RPM header that's being sent to the motherboard so it can communicate, but its power source is coming from a direct cable off your power supply. So that's what you would use that for. Obviously, chassis fans are just that, they're case fans. All right, let's go ahead and now go back to the advanced mode because that's where everyone tends to kind of get themselves messed up. All right, extreme tweaker. AI overclock tuner. It's so counterintuitive on ASUS's BIOS because sure, they do have an AI overclocker sort of on here, which could be technically like you would see right here where it might say AI optimized. We don't see that here, but this is manual overclocking, Expo Profile 1, Expo Profile 2, Expo Tweaked, and Expo On The Fly Plus. This is where things get a little bit confusing because depending on your RAM, your set of RAM, you might have multiple profiles in there. That's what would come from the manufacturer. And typically that could be an XMP and an Expo profile. A lot of RAM is dual validated, so it'll run on Intel and AMD. If you only see the Expo logo on your RAM, it means it's only gone through AMD validation. Doesn't mean those settings won't work on Intel. It just means they haven't been actually validated. ASUS, on the other hand, including MSI and Gigabyte and ASRock, will usually go a step farther and they'll find which RAM sticks tend to be able to go maybe even a little farther or maybe a little bit tighter timings or a little bit additional tuning, if you will, outside of just their Expo or XMP profiles. So you might hit Expo 1, Expo 2, tweaked and on the fly and see the same numbers for all of it. That would just mean that there's no additional settings loaded in this BIOS with those RAM sticks to have any sort of additional tuning to them. I never really worry about any of that. I don't want to introduce potential instability outside of my RAM and my CPU's capabilities. I don't want to now wonder, is the motherboard doing it? Is it the memory controller doing it? Is it the RAM doing it? I don't know. So I just tend to leave the standard Expo profiles loaded for me. Here's the BCLK frequency. This is where I was telling you, if I was to go in there and make this like 101, look what happened to our DDR5. Do you see how that went up 60 megahertz? Not only did our RAM go up 60 megahertz, you can't see it right now, but our CPU would have gone up as well, 53 megahertz, because it would be 1 megahertz times the 53 multiplier. You can see it take effect right here on the RAM, not on the CPU, because we would have to restart. But this changes everything. This is why I say leave the BCLK. All right, F-clock frequency, this is known as the fabric clock. This is specifically an AMD thing. This is the speed, basically, of the interposer connecting the CCDs together. So oftentimes you can leave this at auto, but what you'll find is 2000 megahertz is the sweet spot. And in fact, on auto, you'll often find 2000 megahertz is where it puts itself. I leave this on auto unless I see it put itself to some weird, like 1467 megahertz. Now there's a ratio involved there, and you want to keep it 1-to-1. That's the thing, is you don't want it to be an odd number usually. This is an AMD nuance, so just leave it on auto. If you want to know what's actually running at, you could load like hardware info 64 on your system and then look under the CPU, and you'll actually see the F clock, or referred to as fabric clock, and you can see what those frequencies are. If you want to start tweaking with that, you can actually speed up your CPU and your RAM by speeding up the fabric clock without touching anything else, if the fabric clock is running at a really slow speed. But AMD's gotten really good now at having this tuned out of the box, especially with the motherboard set to auto, so you don't have to mess with that. DRAM timing control, this is where you can go in and manually set all your timings. This is absolutely positively a do not touch scenario unless you know what you're doing. But if you know what you're doing, you're only watching this video for two reasons. One, you're really bored, or two, you're looking for mistakes of mine to call out, which is fine. If there are mistakes, call them out. But this is not an area anybody should be touching, honestly. Just let the RAM profiles do the job. They're what's validated to work with those modules. Precision Boost Overdrive. Now, this is where a lot of people get really confused with AMD. Turning on PBO doesn't automatically give you a huge overclock. What it does is it lifts a lot of the limits. So for instance here, you've got Pro-Chot VRM throttling.
Processor hot.
No, Proc-Chot. So you have processor hot VRM throttling, or I like to call it Pro-Chot. I gave you something, guys, to complain about right there is what I did. Anyway, this is basically, if the processor VRM is hot, do you want it to throttle? You should. That's a good thing. You should have it throttle. You can disable it. If we're doing like extreme overclocking, you can enable it. Auto is also going to be enabled, by the way. Peak current control. So here's the thing, like, you can turn on and off some of this stuff, but it doesn't mean you get control of it, right? Medium load, boost it. That's boost it, by the way, okay? Just want to point that out. That is boost it. So it's funny how we're in the Precision Overdrive menu and we have to go, 4 items down to actually turn on Precision Boost Overdrive. Now here's the thing, you get these different modes. You have disabled, enabled, enhancement, manual, and AMD Eco mode. If you just set it to enabled, you're gonna find now that what essentially is gonna happen, it's gonna lift the PPT, which is the power limits. It's gonna lift the timer at which, how long it can maintain those limits. It'll lift the amps, all of those things. In an effort to keep the boost clocks and the turbo clocks as high as possible for as long as possible. It usually only applies a 200 megahertz potential overclock. More often than not, you don't even see the 200 megahertz. What you see is it doesn't drop over time as the temps go up as much. So if we go here to enhancement, now if this is where we can start to do a little bit of tuning here. So you have some thermal limits right here, right? This is going to depend entirely on your CPU. This is not going to communicate with your CPU and say, hey, where should we set? It's just basically a small, medium, large, 70C, 80C, 90C. Now here's the thing, depending on the CPU you have installed, you might be limiting your performance actually at 80C. Because if you have, say, an AM5 CPU that has a 95C TJ max or thermal junction max, and you set it to 80C as the max thermal limit, it will start to reduce clocks and voltages to not exceed 80C. So this is where undervolting comes in, which is a very AMD thing. That's a whole AMD overclocking video. We won't even talk about that today, but I'm gonna leave it at level 190C with the 9800X3D. Disable current limiter. That is basically saying, do you want to limit the CPU's current, like the amps? Usually when you enable PBO, you don't necessarily disable it. It sets it to like 4096, which is like bit rate disabled, but it's not like physically turned off. You still have to have a limit in there in the controller. So I'm gonna leave that at auto. Precision Overdrive Scaler, manual. I'll be honest, I am not even fully familiar on what the scaler does. I've not spent a lot of time messing with it. I have basically always left it at 2x. CPU boost clock overdrive, enabled positive. per core, max boost clock override plus, that is basically a frequency offset. And I don't think you can even go above 200. Yeah, see, there's that 200 we were talking about. So I said, yes, let's enable boost clock override, which is saying, let's add 200 megahertz positive when under load. That's essentially what we told it. Now you can do this per core. The reason why people might do a per core boost limit is because you have your preferred cores, right? So this is saying right now, 5450 is the max frequency it's allowed to the CPU. And very rarely do you get it. So the preferred cores are the ones that have the higher SP right here. So for instance, if we knew core 0 and core 1 are our best performing cores, maybe we go in there and say, let's go 5500, right? Maybe, yeah, 5500 on those, but then we leave the rest factory, because oftentimes what will happen is you might have certain cores that are capable of a higher clock because they're the preferred cores, but then you have some duds on board, right? That you have the group project, and you got the guy that just shows up and wants to put his name on it and not do anything. You have those cores in your CPU as well, and they're not capable of running at the faster speed that the good cores are. So if you do an all-core overclock, then what happens is you crash based on the lowest common denominator. So per core tuning is actually where you get the most performance out of your CPU. That's not today's video. I'm just explaining what these settings do. Curve optimizer. This is the stuff you've heard people talk about quite a bit. Curve optimizer is basically saying, go in and test each of these cores, figure out the best voltage and frequency for the core. Oftentimes you can get the same frequency at a lower voltage. Lower voltage equals less power draw, means less heat, means more turbo time. It's turbo time. Sorry, that was from Jingle All the Way. It's turbo time. Okay, so anyway, so you can tell it to do it just based on all cores, with all cores locked, right? And then it will start doing the curve shaper, basically where it's going to determine what that negative offset's going to look like on millivolts, whether it's minus 10, minus 20, minus 30, whatever. Or you can do it on a per core basis, which is a similar version of what we just talked about with the per core PBO, only it will do this with the undervolting per core, which is the recommended way, but it takes the longest because it has to run those tests per core, or per CCD. Now the 9800X3D only has one CCD, so that's the same thing as doing it as all cores. But if you had a multi-CCD CPU like a 9950X3D, 9950, 9900, 7900, 7950, those have two CCDs. So you could have the CCDs locked across the board, but you can have each CCD have different frequencies based on how good those cores are. So that's what that is right there. Graphics curve optimizer, same thing, but that's for the iGPU that's built in. Now that's if you have an iGPU. Obviously the 9800X3D does have an iGPU, but not all of the AMD CPUs have iGPUs. So keep that in mind. Curve shaper, this is basically right here where it's based on, it's the same sort of thing like we talked about with the millivolts, but it's also based off of frequency versus temperature. Okay, so that's just a further step of the undervolting, if you will, but this is specifically taking temperature into account as well. All right, so CO load guard basically says right here, it switches over to a safe curve optimizer value during periods of very heavy loading. It's basically a fail-safe or a fallback if it's seeing a lot of load to go into a more safer curve, especially if your curve has positives. You can also have a positive offset on your curve. Most people use Most people use the curve optimizer specifically for undervolting, but you can also use it for overvolting as well. So if you had an overvolt applied and you're under very heavy load scenario, it could fall back to a less aggressive curve to make sure that it's not gonna stress the cores or keep the temperature and the power draw too high. Okay, so core tuning's configuration for gaming, I've never messed with it. I have no idea what it does. I'm not gonna touch it here. How it knows the difference between a gaming load and a regular load, I don't know. But anyway, core performance boost. So that's basically like the AMD or the ASUS version of the enhancements, auto enhancements that AMD can apply, or that ASUS can apply to AMD CPUs, similar to how they were doing with Intel CPUs. We also know that the trouble that got motherboard manufacturers in with doing that with Intel CPUs. So I don't know if it's something you should necessarily use. CPU core ratio. This is where you can see auto, CPU core ratio, or optimize. This is my locked overclock, if you will, technically. There's AI optimize, which basically wants to go in and set some predetermined values to see if they'll work. If they don't, they'll adjust them automatically. I don't use AI optimized on this system because we have it locked down. So I have us locked to a CPU core ratio of 53, which is 5300 megahertz for the core. It doesn't change. It's 5300 all the time, even when sitting idle at the desktop, because this is how we remove CPU bottlenecks as much as possible, or CPU fluctuation from our GPU testing. The only thing we want changing is our GPU in these tests. Now you can do the same thing per CCX like we talked about right here, right? So CPU core ratio per CCX, this is just core ratio for all CPUs. So we haven't touched any of this. That's why all this is disabled. DIGI VRM, this is where you can go in and actually play around with all the different voltage settings of your CPU. Highly recommended you don't touch it. If you're watching this video, you probably don't understand what it is. If you already understand what it is, then you're probably an XOCer because nobody else would really touch those. Performance bias is so funny. It's like, if you want a better CBR23 score, click that, and it should give you a better score. Now, it's artificial. It's not gonna actually give you a truly better experience across your CPU or your PC. It's just basically for getting the best score you can if you're doing overclocking competitions. Geekbench 3, a little out of date considering we're on 6 now. So, whatever. All right, Tweaker's Paradise, also known as Victorville, California, and Apple Valley. This is where you can go in and absolutely just tweak every single aspect of your CPU. All of this stuff is straight up voltage tuning. Nothing that is going to apply to anyone in this video. There's nothing in here for you to need to mess with. All right, so CoreFlex is really interesting here. So basically it's setting algorithms. For programmers, it'd be like an if-then type of statement in programming. So algorithm 1, it was set to auto. If we do enabled, algorithm condition of CPU temperature, CPU voltage, or core current. So let's say our CPU temperature, the action is if the CPU temperature hits a thermal limit and then the threshold value of, I don't know, 90, not 960, 90, and then maybe the additional 95, right? Action value. So you can basically set if, then, thens. So if this happens, then this happens. And really it's about tuning the core behavior. It's not something I think, unless you're really good at tuning, that you should go in and mess with. It's just an additional feature that ASUS motherboards implement to give you more control over your CPU, not something that's important to have. AI features. Processor utilization. It's just like an info page right here. Recalibrate cooler. That's what I talked about over here. Ignore it. All right, we don't care about the way it optimizes its cooler. We just don't worry about that, okay? Actual VRM core voltage. This is where you can go in and actually type in a core voltage. Now you're gonna have things like droop, right? So I've actually put in 1.285. You can see it's actually doing 1.279. I prefer to do actual core voltage tuning like this. It is not efficient, but this rig only does GPU testing. So because it's not a 24/7 system, I don't care that it's gonna be drawing more power and creating more heat when it's on. Also too, it means that I can keep control over my voltages. And I know that 1.285 volts based on my testing is where I can run 5.3 gigahertz all day long. 5.4 is not stable no matter what I do with the voltages. Heat goes up, stability doesn't improve. So this is where I landed. So SOC voltage, as you can see right here, might help with memory frequency overclock. It might be something you need to touch too if you're running very fast DIMMs, since AMD now supports technically like 8,000 plus DIMMs. I don't mean how many DIMMs, I mean 8,000 plus mega transfer DIMMs. You might have to go in there and tweak some of the SOC, because the SOC won't necessarily change based on the XMP or the Expo profile. So if you find that you're trying to run really fast memory and it changes the memory voltage and all that sort of stuff, and you find that you're still unstable, you might start bumping this up a little bit or adding an offset where you can basically add, I think how it's only giving me negative offset, but as it even says right there, negative offset. So you could go in and manually add, like say I want 1.3 volts, right? So leave it at auto most of the time. CPU, VDDIO, and memory controller voltage, that's specifically a memory controller. This is the value right here that the Expo profile changes. So you can leave that. Miscellaneous voltage. Miscellaneous voltage supplies power to the thermal VDDIG rails, which power the GMI bus. If you know what that is, go ahead and mess with it. The rest here is just DRAM voltage. As you can see, the VDDQ is set to 1.4. Advanced memory voltages. Again, things you really don't need to mess with. Okay, let's talk about the stuff that actually matters to you here. All right, trusted computing. This is the TPM stuff. You've probably heard trusted platform module, which used to be a physical device that had to be added to older systems, but now they're built into motherboards. This should be on and enabled by default. If it wasn't, you wouldn't even be able to install Windows 11 if you're running Windows 11. So leave all this alone. Don't touch any of this. If you mess with any of this, you could broke your operating system. AMD FTPM configuration. This is where you can go in and turn, like, you can turn on and off the TPM. So you notice here, it's just showing that it's on, right? Device found. You can see here is where you can turn it on and off. Do not turn it off, otherwise your operating system will not work anymore. UEFI variable protection. This is CPU configuration in this particular menu doesn't mean anything to us. PCI Subsystem Settings. This is where you could go in and resizable bar is always on by default now, but you've probably seen a lot of GPUs and a lot of games now require resizable bar. That's where you would find it in this BIOS. Nothing else on this page matters to us. USB configuration. I mean, you can see all your USB ports and their speeds and stuff, and you can turn them on and off if you want. USB mass storage driver support. All this stuff should just be left on defaults. Messing with this stuff could absolutely break your system. Again, you could turn off different controllers needed for USB. NVMe configuration, this is where you see your different drives and different information about the drive, the vendor, device ID, the size. Self-test option, this is a built-in self-test or test that the BIOS can do to test on your drive if you think you might be having drive problems, short or extended. Controller test or controller namespace test. We don't have any hard drives, so there's clearly nothing here attached to it. We have no SATA drives attached, but this is where you would set RAID and all of that sort of such for your SATA controller. Don't need to mess with that. APM is what happens when you turn on and off. Okay, so this is where sometimes I'll have people say like, why does my computer keep turning itself on randomly? This is where different devices, like things that are hooked up to your network, things that are hooked up to your PCI Express, even your mouse or keyboard, can be used as power switches. So my system upstairs likes to turn itself on because the HP printer kept pinging devices on the network saying, hey, are y'all there? Can y'all hear me? My computer would wake up and go, yeah, I'm here. And then it would boot and it'd be at its desktop when I would come to work, even though I kept turning it off. So this is where devices that are like boot on LAN, I don't see it right here, but boot on LAN is an option. Power on by PCI, power on by RTC. Restore AC after power loss. So this is if, for instance, your power went out at your house or your cat stepped on your power strip and turned it off. What will your computer do when it sees power again? Will it return itself on or will it wait for you to turn it on? So default is stay powered off. Last state's a good one to have too, I guess. If it's like, say, a server or something that you always need up, you would want it to go to last state. So if the system was on when it lost power, it'll turn itself back on. But if it was off when it saw like, because the motherboard, you know how it lights up when you plug it into the wall, even though it's not on? It can still sense when power is going to it. So if it was off when it lost power, it'll just stay in that state. So you can also just default it on or off. I'm gonna leave it powered off. So ErP Ready is basically it disables all of the wake on LAN type stuff that I said. Like if you enable it, it's very aggressive. It will even disable the RGB from your system. Because do you know how many trees the RGB in your system is killing? Okay, anyway, power on by PCI makes sense. That's for like network cards and such that can also like specific, usually there's very interesting specific scenarios where you can have a PCI controller in like a workstation or a server or whatever, and then you actually will function, you can function the system through the PCI Express. That's what this is. It also means that you, like I talked about wake on LAN, it's built into the PCI Express too, because the LAN is part of the PCI Express subset. So, and then there's power on by RTC, which is funny, I like how there's no tooltip here. Real-time clock, if you enable it, you can tell it what time of the day to automatically turn itself on. So, onboard device configuration. This is where you can turn on and off various things that are built into your motherboard. You can turn off the Wi-Fi controller, you can turn off the 10G, turn off the 5G, turn off the audio, turn off USB. This is bifurcation modes. We have a whole video about bifurcation. I'm not gonna go in that today. Make sure you guys check that out if you don't know. A lot of people had a lot of eye-opening, oh my God, I didn't know I was doing this to my system. So bifurcation is important to know. Turn off Bluetooth. You can control the lighting right here. Q-code function, like Q-code is the numbers that show up on your motherboard. If you have a Q-code readout, which is used for troubleshooting, you can have it postcode only, disable, auto. My motherboard here, when it's booted into the OS, turns it into a temperature gauge for the CPU package. So they have different functions you can use them for. USB power delivery in soft state. This would be, for instance, like if you're trying to charge a phone over your USB, or will your mouse continue to get power, or your keyboard get power in different power states of the system. So if you ever turn off your system and you notice your mother or your keyboard stays lit up, you might have some adjusting to do here. ASM 1162 configuration. That's the AS media storage controller. Most people don't need to care about that. PCIe link speed. This is where you can go in and be like, you know what? I just want to make sure that my Gen 5 device is for sure getting Gen 5. Now, the reason why I don't want to do that right now is I have a Gen 4 card plugged in here right now. So if I were to force it to Gen 5, it very well may not activate my graphics card. So you want to leave it to auto. The device will communicate with the motherboard what gen it is. So it's best to leave it on auto unless you are just comfortable with saying, I'm going to leave it on Gen 5 if it's a Gen 5 or Gen 4 or whatever, just to guarantee you're getting the fastest interconnect speed with the PCI Express device. Same thing here with all the other things that use PCI Express on here. Okay, AMD CBS. This is not a TV station, as much as it might sound like one. This allows you to take full control over your CPU, but this is AMD's control over the CPU. What I showed you earlier was ASUS's motherboard functions have taken over the CPU. AMD's settings will take priority over the motherboard settings if you change these settings. Otherwise, when they're set to auto, they're just gonna mirror and on their auto setting that you can't see, whatever you set in the motherboard configuration for the vendor. But if you go in here and start messing with this, this should take priority over your motherboard settings. So this is basically for old school AMD guys that are just really comfortable with the AMD naming convention and the name AMD settings. This is where you can go in and take control over your CPU. So global C state, like let's just say, for instance, here we disable that. Like this is just going to allow us to be able to change the basically the C states of the CPU, which basically says under certain load conditions or power conditions, let the CPU either throttle up or throttle down, right? IOMMU, don't need to mess with that. ECC, don't need to mess with that. SMT control, simultaneous multi-threading, that's basically turning on or off hyper-threading for AMD CPUs. Core performance boost. That just basically says, do you want the auto turbo functions in the CPU to work or not? So leave them on auto for yes and disable them for no. CPU common options here, but this is like prefetcher settings. We don't need to worry about that. Core watchdog. But all of this is very low level CPU stuff that you really shouldn't go in here messing with. PBS, same sort of thing right here. Low level stuff you should not be messing with. But AMD overclocking, this is where the AMD overclockers become very comfortable, right? Manual CPU overclocking, core frequency, core voltage, core count. This is where you can turn on and off SMT. You can turn on and off different. It's so old school. It pops up like the old school menu. This is where you can turn on and off individual cores per CCD. We only have one CCD, so it's 0. Its count starts at 0, by the way. So CCD 0, CCD 1 is what you would see if you had 2 CCDs. But this is where you can turn on and off individual cores. Bitmap down core discard changes. I think that's where you can undo any of the settings you just did there, right? And then you have obviously your like processor hot VRM throttling. It's just the same thing you saw in the other menu. It's just here as well. And then peak current control, where you can basically set how much current the CPU is allowed to have. None of that stuff is what anyone should be messing with, especially the LN2 mode. Enabling LN2 mode is essentially reducing many of the safeguards that are in place. Let's talk about this though. This is where a lot of you will probably spend a lot of your time. Temperature monitoring. This is where you can see the different temperatures in your system right here. So right here, you can ignore the temperatures if you want to. There's no reason to ignore temperatures. Unless you're just like, danger to manifold, shut up, and you want to close the lid. If it's like turning red and running too hot and you want to shut up, I don't want to know, you could, I guess, ignore it and stick your head in the sand that you're melting your CPU. But if you come down here to fan speed monitors, this is where you can see right now the CPU fan speed's at 3,237 RPM, which is the speed of the fans on the AIO that I had plugged into it. And then there's the pump speed, as you can see right there. I actually think I have this backwards. I do believe that this is the fans and this is the pump. So doesn't matter, they work, so I don't care, it's just a test bench. But if you ever turned on your system and you start getting that warning that's like, warning, CPU fan not detected, or whatever, you know, thinks there's no CPU fan, it's doing that because it doesn't want you to kill your system or hurt it or damage it due to excessive temperature. This is where if you knew for whatever reason, I have a cooler, it is working, it is plugged in, stop warning me, you go into the fan speed monitor, go to CPU fan speed and set it to ignore. Okay, I don't recommend doing that. I recommend plugging something into the CPU header, but that's the way you can bypass it if you have that issue. Same thing with all of these other headers right here. These are just the different fan headers on the motherboard. Voltage monitoring, You can ignore those as well, but this is just a nice to make sure everything's working right. Q-fan configuration is where you can go in and actually tune your fans. Now this is more like basic, this is more basic looking right here because we're in the advanced menu, which sounds counterintuitive, but Q-fan control, you can tell it, is it a DC fan, means it's only 3 pins, or is it a PWM fan, which means it has 4 pins. You can then go in here and set different curves, standard, silent, turbo, full speed, or manual. Now manual basically, it's like setting up a curve, it's just very basic looking right here. So you'll have different manual curves that you can set depending on your motherboard. But we'll say the CPU, we'll base the temperature off CPU package. Fans step up, level 1, level 2, 3, 4, 5. This is how fast the ramp will tend to be on how, like, you know, sometimes the fans will just go from like 0 to 100 real fast. You can set a longer ramp time so it's more smooth as it goes up. But if you go back to basic mode, you can do it right here with a visual curve, which is way easier. So look, if I was to go manual, right? Dude, now I can just slide those around where I want. So don't worry about doing it the other way. Do it in here into the Q-fan setup. Okay, so boot configuration. This is where sometimes people get a little messed up. You can do, so CSM, Compatibility Support Module, it's basically like an older legacy type of BIOS that will layer itself on top of the UEFI BIOS. But because that will be considered the visible BIOS, it'll break newer operating systems that require TPM and other UEFI BIOS. That's the only time you should ever use that, and if that system's only going to be used for that. Because if you have CSM enabled and then you try to install Windows, oftentimes it won't install. It may not even show, the drive may not even show up, especially if you're dealing with NVMe's and such. It gets very nuanced. So this is just about having older legacy OS support on new BIOS. Don't mess with it. And more importantly, it'll disable TPM and secure boot because the old BIOS don't even support those. So that's why modern OSs won't even work if you have CSM enabled. Or let's say, for instance, you have a fully working system right now like we do. If I go in here and enable that and reboot the system, my bootloader will disappear. You won't be able to see it anymore. Oftentimes, this is what people mess with and didn't realize it, or they accidentally toggled it, and then suddenly they're like, I'm just booting into BIOS, I can't get into my OS, because they might have enabled either legacy BIOS or CSM. Secure boot, that's pretty obvious right here. This is where you might have found Battlefield 6 or something, and you were like, oh crap, I apparently don't have secure boot enabled, and so you couldn't play Battlefield because Javelin wouldn't load because it is a kernel level anti-cheat. So people would then go in and enable their secure boot, and then bad things have happened to people. It's kind of difficult to have the rhyme or reason as to who and why, but the point is, you should always make sure secure boot and such is on before installing your OS. That is the safest way. If you currently have it off and you have a Windows operating system that's working, and you need it on later, good luck. Do some research on backups and restorations and all that stuff just to make sure, and maybe even clone a drive just in case. Boot configuration, this is where you can just have like how long the post screen sets up there for, where will it immediately go into BIOS or will it go into the last booted device. If you have multiple drives, you can set it to, this is where you tune the startup process, right? You might be finding that, like I said earlier, the splash screen may not pop up. Or you might be trying to get into BIOS and you're hitting delete and it's not happening, or you're trying to get into an installer like a Windows install key and you're just like, what the heck, I can't get this installer to show up. It might be because fast boot is turned on. Fast boot basically wants to leave so many of the last known configs and devices loaded in to volatile memory, and then what'll happen is it'll just not do a full shutdown when you shut down the system, but when you turn on the system, it more or less restores itself to where it was. That way you can get to the operating system faster. So it doesn't go through a full post or anything like that. If you are having a problem getting into your BIOS, or you're having a problem getting into installer drives or whatever, it's a good idea to disable fast boot. Fast boot's on by default on most systems. I just want to point that out. But post delay time is only set to 3 seconds. You can make that longer if you want to make sure you don't miss that delete key mashing, right? So I just leave it at 3 on default. What does the numlock state on your num key when you turn on the system, right? Okay, and then our boot options right here. If I had more than one drive, that's where I would see them right here. Because of the fact that I don't only have one drive, I can't access boot priorities. But if I had multiple drives in here, and I don't know why this happens, but I've had so many motherboards do this to me where sometimes it just randomly goes, you know what, let's just change those. Let's just change which drive it tries to boot from. And then instead of having my bootloader be recognized, it's trying to load to one of my mass storage drives or something, and then I get bootloader not found, and it's just like, oh my God, what the hell? And I go into the BIOS and realize it switched its order for no reason whatsoever, didn't update the BIOS, didn't do a damn thing. Just turn the system off and turn it back on, and it was like, let's just roll the 20-sided die on whether or not your system's gonna boot today. That sucks, but it happens. So if that's happening to you, you might need to look at your boot priorities. Also too, if you know you have different drives on your system, maybe you have multiple OS drives on your system, and you by default want to always boot to, let's say Windows 11, but you also have some Linux drives or something in there, and you don't have any sort of a bootloader like page that pops up for you to select where you want to boot, you can come in here and the different drives that are listed here, you could just scroll to that drive, like key down to it, hit enter, and it will just automatically load that drive OS. That's pretty much where we're gonna stop today. That was a longer video than I expected it to be, but we didn't even scratch the surface of what's capable with the motherboard. But I spent a lot of time, and the BIOS, I spent a lot of time talking about the overclocking stuff, because that's where people are gonna go in and maybe just change a couple values and not realize the major effect it can have on the stability of your system, and or not even posting anymore at all. And that's where that clear CMOS button becomes very handy. You know, one thing I want to point out that I forgot to mention here is I want to go to, in the tool section here, this is obviously where we can flash the BIOS, a user profile. I don't care if it is Gigabyte, MSI, Asus, ASRock, whoever. If you have a known working good config, save it. Save it, because if you go in and start messing with stuff, it is so much more, like, you'll enjoy life way more if you can just literally be like, oh, I have a known good config, so I'm gonna save that. So what I'm gonna do right now is I'm going to save to profile one, enter yes. Now it's gonna show up there, there it is. So now if I were to go around and mess with anything or bork anything, then I could absolutely just reload to it. You can also save them to a USB drive, which is handy to have, because more often than not, when you update the BIOS, you lose the profiles, which really sucks. So being able to save them to a USB drive is a newer feature that motherboards have started implementing. It wasn't around forever, and that is a definite nice to have. All right, guys, thanks for watching. If you want me to do an Intel version of this for all 7 of you that are still using Intel out there, sound off in the comments below. It's got a bit of differences. Then most of it's the same, but obviously when it comes to the CPU section and such, it's entirely different. Hopefully this has helped you guys feel a little bit more comfortable with navigating your BIOS. But I'm gonna tell you right now, for most people, you don't gotta touch it other than enabling XMP and maybe playing around with your fan configs if you're using the motherboard to control your fans and not a dedicated controller or software like fan control. All right, guys, thanks for watching. As always, we'll see you in the next one.